For 15 years, she'd been Miss Margaret to everyone in Millbrook, the librarian who recommended romance novels to lonely widows and helped kids with science projects. Nobody suspected that the woman stamping due dates had once carried classified documents across hostile borders in operations that didn't exist. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden identities and unexpected guardians, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who protect us in ways we never imagine. Millbrook Public Library sat at the heart of a town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the morning paper. The two-story brick building with its tall windows and creaking wooden floors had been the community's intellectual center for over a century, housing not just books, but memories, relationships, and the quiet rhythms of small-town life. And for the past 15 years, it had been Margaret Chen's domain. To the 8,000 residents of Millbrook, Margaret was exactly what a small-town librarian should be. Soft-spoken, infinitely patient, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to find exactly the right book for exactly the right person. She wore cardigans in colors that matched the changing seasons, kept her graying hair in a neat bun, and moved through the library stacks with the quiet efficiency of someone who had memorized the location of every volume. Children adored her. She knew their reading levels, their favorite subjects, and could guide even the most reluctant student to a book that would capture their imagination. Teenagers respected her because she never judged, never pried, and somehow always had exactly the research materials they needed for their last-minute assignments. Adults trusted her with their literary secrets. She knew who checked out romance novels under cover of darkness, who struggled with adult literacy classes, and who came to the library not for books, but for the simple human connection of being somewhere they belonged. What none of them knew was that Margaret Chen's real expertise wasn't in organizing information, it was in hiding it. 20 years earlier, Margaret Chen had been known by a different name in circles that didn't officially exist. As Dr. Sarah Liu, she had been one of the CIA's most effective intelligence operatives, specializing in what the agency euphemistically called information acquisition and protection. Her work had taken her to places that didn't appear on tourist maps, safe houses in Eastern Europe where state secrets changed hands like playing cards, research facilities in developing nations where scientific breakthroughs were bought and sold, corporate headquarters where industrial espionage was indistinguishable from international warfare. Margaret's gift wasn't just her ability to blend into any environment, it was her talent for reading people. She could identify a lie in the micro-expressions that flashed across someone's face before they spoke. She could detect surveillance by noticing the subtle patterns that betrayed trained watchers. Most importantly, she could spot danger long before it became obvious to anyone else. Her final assignment had been her most dangerous, extracting a defecting scientist from a facility where discovery meant not just mission failure, but international incident. The operation had succeeded, but barely. Margaret had been burned, her cover blown, her identity compromised. The scientist was safe, but Margaret Chen could never work in the field again. The CIA had offered her a desk job at Langley, a comfortable position analyzing intelligence reports and training new operatives. Instead, Margaret had requested something that shocked her supervisors: complete separation from the agency, a new identity, and permission to disappear entirely. "Why?" her handler had asked. "You're one of our best. We can find you work that—" "I've spent 20 years keeping other people's secrets," Margaret had interrupted. "Now I want to keep my own." The agency had reluctantly agreed, providing her with a legend so deep and so carefully constructed that even she sometimes forgot where Margaret Chen ended and Sarah Liu began. The small town of Millbrook had been chosen because it was exactly the kind of place where a quiet librarian could live unremarkably for decades. What the CIA hadn't anticipated was how completely Margaret would embrace her new identity, and how perfectly her old skills would translate to her new environment. Running a small-town library required many of the same skills that had made Margaret effective as an intelligence operative. She needed to read people, understand their motivations, and anticipate their needs. She had to organize vast amounts of information and make it accessible to people who often weren't sure what they were looking for. Most importantly, she had to be trustworthy, someone people could confide in without fear of judgment or betrayal. Margaret excelled at all of it. She memorized not just the catalog system, but the personal histories of her patrons. She knew that Mrs. Henderson checked out gardening books every spring because she was still trying to recreate the roses her late husband had grown. She understood that teenager Jake Miller's sudden interest in college prep books meant he was trying to escape a family situation that kept him at the library until closing time most nights. Her years of reading people in life or death situations made her extraordinarily sensitive to the subtle distress signals that people in small towns often tried to hide. She could spot domestic abuse in the way someone avoided eye contact. She recognized financial stress in the desperation with which parents searched for free educational resources. She identified depression in the isolated teenagers who spent entire days in the stacks, hiding from worlds that didn't seem to have room for them. And she helped. Not dramatically, not obtrusively, but with the same precision she had once used to plan covert operations. A strategically recommended book, a casual mention of resources that might be available, a quiet conversation that provided exactly the guidance someone needed without making them feel like they had asked for help. The people of Millbrook thought Margaret was simply a gifted librarian. In reality, she was conducting the most complex and rewarding operation of her career, protecting an entire community by understanding its needs and vulnerabilities better than anyone else. 15 years into her new life, Margaret had settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. She opened the library at 9 a.m., helped patrons until 6 p.m., and spent evenings in her small apartment above the building, reading books that had nothing to do with international intrigue or state secrets. It was a peaceful existence, and Margaret had almost convinced herself that her old life was truly behind her. Until the morning when 3 strangers walked into her library, asking questions that made her field instincts scream warnings. They came separately over the course of a week, each posing as researchers working on different projects. The first claimed to be a genealogist, helping families trace their immigrant ancestors. The second said he was a historian documenting small-town America during the Cold War. The third introduced herself as a journalist, writing about the decline of rural libraries. To most people, their questions would have seemed innocent, even mundane. But Margaret heard the patterns underneath the surface inquiries. They weren't asking about the library's history. They were mapping its vulnerabilities. They weren't interested in local families. They were identifying long-term residents who might remember details about newer arrivals. They weren't documenting rural libraries. They were assessing Margaret's daily routines and security measures. Someone was conducting surveillance, professional surveillance. Margaret's training kicked in automatically. She began varying her routines in subtle ways, taking different routes to and from work, altering her schedule unpredictably. She started paying closer attention to the people around her, looking for faces that appeared too often or in places where they didn't belong. Most importantly, she began preparing for the possibility that her carefully constructed life in Millbrook was about to end. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Patterson, a high school senior who spent most afternoons at the library working on college applications, mentioned something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Miss Margaret," he said during one of their regular check-ins, "there's this weird van that's been parked across from my house for the past few days. Mom thinks it's just construction workers, but they never actually do any work. They just sit there." Tommy lived 3 blocks from the library, in a house with a direct line of sight to Margaret's apartment windows. "Have you seen the people in the van?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice casual. "Yeah, there's usually 2 guys. They take pictures sometimes, but not of anything interesting. Just buildings and stuff." Margaret excused herself and walked to the reference desk, her mind racing. If they were conducting visual surveillance from Tommy's neighborhood, they already knew where she lived. If they were taking photographs, they were documenting her patterns and possibly preparing for some kind of operation. The question was whether they were there to capture her or eliminate her. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She opened a hidden panel in her apartment's bedroom closet and retrieved the emergency kit she had hoped never to need again. Inside the waterproof case were items that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Cash in multiple currencies, 3 different sets of identification documents, a secure satellite phone, and a small pistol that looked like a toy, but had been designed for situations where conventional weapons would be impractical. Margaret had hoped she would rust these items, testament to a life successfully left behind. Instead, she found herself checking the phone's battery and confirming that the weapon was still properly maintained. 20 years of training doesn't disappear just because you decide to live a quiet life. She made the call that night, using encryption protocols that she prayed were still active. The voice that answered the secure line was one Margaret hadn't heard in over a decade, but she recognized it immediately. "Phoenix," the voice said, using her old operational code name. "We wondered if we'd ever hear from you again." "I need information, David," Margaret said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Someone's been asking questions about me, and I don't think they're friendly." David Kowalski had been her handler during her final years with the agency. He was one of the few people who knew both her real identity and her legend, which made him either her best resource or her greatest vulnerability. "How long?" he asked. "First contact was a week ago. They're running a textbook reconnaissance operation, but they're being sloppy about it. Either they don't know who they're looking for, or they don't care if I spot them." "That's not good. If they're not worried about you detecting surveillance, then they're confident they can handle me if I run, or they're planning to move before I can react." There was silence on the other end of the line while David accessed databases that Margaret no longer had clearance to see. "Phoenix," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you had any contact with your old life? Any use of skills or knowledge that might have flagged you in someone's system?" Margaret thought carefully. "Nothing operational. I've helped people in town with problems, but nothing that would require classified knowledge or techniques." "What kind of problems?" "Domestic situations, kids in trouble. Nothing that would..." Margaret stopped mid-sentence as a realization hit her. 6 months earlier, she had helped Sarah Mitchell, a young mother who was being stalked by her ex-husband. The man had been following Sarah and her daughter, showing up at their house, making threats. Local law enforcement had been sympathetic, but limited in what they could do without concrete evidence of violence. Margaret had suggested that Sarah might benefit from learning some basic personal security measures. She had taught her how to vary her routines, how to identify surveillance, and how to create multiple safe exit strategies from her home and workplace. All techniques that Margaret had learned during her CIA training, though she had presented them as common-sense precautions that anyone might know. Sarah's ex-husband had been arrested 2 weeks later for violating a restraining order. But during the arrest, he had been found with detailed surveillance photos, expensive electronic monitoring equipment, and what appeared to be professional-grade intelligence-gathering tools. "David," Margaret said slowly, "I think I may have inadvertently helped someone identify a foreign intelligence operation." David's investigation took 18 hours, and the results were worse than Margaret had feared. Sarah Mitchell's ex-husband, Marcus Webb, had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service 3 years earlier. His stalking of his ex-wife had been cover for a much more sophisticated operation, identifying and monitoring former CIA operatives living under deep cover identities. Webb had been feeding information to his handlers about anyone in the community who displayed knowledge or skills that might indicate intelligence training. Margaret's advice to Sarah had been expertly delivered, clearly the product of professional education, and had led directly to Webb's capture when he tried to implement counter-surveillance against someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The Foreign Service had lost their asset, their operation had been compromised, and they had traced the security expertise back to the quiet librarian who had somehow taught a small-town mother to think like a spy. "They know who you are, Phoenix," David told her during their second call. "They know where you are, and they're coming." "How long do I have?" "The surveillance team you spotted?" "They're not there to capture you. They're advanced scouts for a direct action team. Best estimate is 48 hours before they move." Margaret looked around her apartment at the life she had built book by book, relationship by relationship, over 15 years of careful construction. Can the agency extract me? We can have a team there in 6 hours, full relocation, new identity, complete separation from Millbrook. And the people here? What about them? If I disappear without explanation, they'll ask questions. If they ask questions, your people will have to provide answers. Those answers will put everyone I've helped at risk of retaliation. David was quiet for a moment. Phoenix, your primary responsibility is to your own safety. These people aren't your mission. They've been my mission for 15 years, Margaret said quietly. I'm not abandoning them now. Margaret spent the rest of that night doing something she had never done before, planning an operation where success meant protecting civilians rather than completing an objective. It required different thinking, different priorities, and a level of personal risk that would have been unacceptable in her old life. She couldn't simply run. Too many people in Millbrook depended on the library, and her sudden disappearance would create questions that could put them in danger. She couldn't stay and hide because the foreign operatives already knew where to find her, and she couldn't call in the CIA because an official response would transform Millbrook into an intelligence battlefield where innocent people could be caught in the crossfire. She had to eliminate the threat herself, quietly and completely, in a way that would protect both her cover and her community. Margaret began by doing what librarians do best: research. She used databases that she technically no longer had access to, employing login credentials that should have been deactivated years ago, but had somehow remained active. She identified the surveillance team, their probable mission parameters, and their most likely approach routes. Then, she began implementing security measures that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever fortified a safe house in hostile territory. She varied her routines even more dramatically, making herself unpredictable and difficult to target. She identified defensive positions within the library that could provide cover and concealment. Most importantly, she prepared contingency plans that would protect the people of Millbrook if the situation escalated beyond her control. But Margaret also did something that her CIA training had never covered. She prepared to defend her community using the community itself. Over 15 years, Margaret had helped dozens of people in Millbrook with problems ranging from domestic violence to financial fraud to substance abuse. She had connected people with resources, provided guidance during crises, and served as a confidential counselor for problems that people couldn't share with anyone else. What she realized now was that she had accidentally created an intelligence network. Tommy Patterson, the high school student who had first spotted the surveillance van, had been coming to the library since middle school. Margaret had helped him navigate family problems when his father lost his job, guided him through college prep when his guidance counselor was overwhelmed, and provided emotional support when he struggled with anxiety and depression. Tommy trusted her completely, and more importantly, he was smart enough to follow instructions without asking unnecessary questions. Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose ex-husband had been the foreign asset, now worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She had access to emergency services, understanding of crisis protocols, and personal experience with surveillance and counter-surveillance. She also owed Margaret her life. Jim Rodriguez, the police chief, regularly consulted Margaret about community problems that weren't technically criminal but still needed attention. He respected her judgment, trusted her discretion, and had learned to take her concerns seriously even when he didn't understand their source. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who ran the free clinic, had worked with Margaret on numerous cases involving domestic abuse, substance problems, and mental health crises. She understood operational security from a medical perspective and could provide both intelligence and logistical support if needed. Margaret realized that she didn't have to face the foreign operatives alone. She had resources that her old CIA handlers had never possessed, an entire community of people who trusted her judgment and were willing to help protect something they all valued. She just had to figure out how to mobilize them without explaining why. Margaret's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to defeat a professional surveillance and direct action team using traditional intelligence methods, She would use community-based strategies that would be invisible to outside observers, but devastating to anyone who didn't understand the social dynamics of small-town America. She started with Tommy Patterson. During his usual after-school visit to the library, Margaret asked him if he would be interested in earning some extra money by helping with a special project. "There are some people in town doing research for what they claim is a historical documentary," she told him, "but I have concerns about their credentials and their methods. I'd like you to keep an eye on them and let me know if you notice anything unusual about their behavior." Tommy was thrilled to be trusted with what seemed like detective work. Margaret provided him with basic surveillance detection techniques, presented as ways to gather information for legitimate researchers. Within 2 days, Tommy had identified not just the van near his house, but 2 additional vehicles, a pattern of movement that revealed a much larger operation than Margaret had initially suspected. She approached Sarah Mitchell next, asking for help with what she described as a community safety concern. Margaret explained that there were visitors in town who seemed to be targeting the library and other community institutions, possibly as part of a scam or fraud operation. "I know this might sound paranoid," Margaret said, "but I learned some things during my previous work that make me concerned about these people's real intentions." Sarah didn't ask what Margaret's previous work had been. She simply nodded and agreed to coordinate with the hospital's emergency protocols to ensure that medical support would be immediately available if needed. Chief Rodriguez was the most delicate approach. Margaret couldn't directly tell him about foreign intelligence operatives without revealing her own background. Instead, she mentioned that several community members had expressed concerns about unfamiliar visitors who seemed to be conducting surveillance. "I know it might not be anything criminal," she said, "but with everything that's been happening in the world, I thought you should be aware." Rodriguez trusted Margaret's instincts enough to quietly increase police patrols in the library district and to ensure that response times to any emergency calls would be faster than usual. Within 3 days, Margaret had created a defensive network that covered surveillance, medical support, and law enforcement response. The foreign operatives were now being watched by people they couldn't identify, surrounded by resources they didn't know existed, and operating in an environment where any aggressive action would trigger responses they couldn't predict or control. They had come to Millbrook expecting to find an isolated former CIA operative living alone with no support structure. Instead, they had encountered a community mobilized by someone who understood both intelligence operations and the social bonds that made small towns more resilient than any government agency. The foreign team made their move on a Thursday evening, exactly 48 hours after David's warning. They had chosen the time carefully, after the library closed, but before most people in the downtown area went home for dinner. They expected to find Margaret alone, vulnerable, and cut off from any potential help. Instead, they found themselves walking into a trap that used the entire town as its mechanism. Margaret was indeed alone in the library when the 3 operatives approached the building. But Tommy Patterson was watching from his usual observation post, with instructions to immediately contact Chief Rodriguez if the visitors approached the library outside normal hours. Sarah Mitchell was at the hospital, coordinating with emergency services in case medical support was needed. Dr. Harper was standing by at the clinic, ready to respond to any crisis. The operatives had planned to enter through the library's rear entrance, subdue Margaret quickly, and extract her without anyone in the community realizing what had happened. It was a sound plan that would have worked against an isolated target. It failed within the first 30 seconds. Tommy's call brought Chief Rodriguez and 2 patrol officers to the library district in under 3 minutes. Sarah's coordination with emergency services meant that paramedics were already en route before anyone knew if they would be needed. Dr. Harper's presence at the clinic provided a secondary response point if the primary location was compromised. But most importantly, Margaret was ready. The first operative who entered the library through the rear door found himself facing someone who moved with the fluid precision of a professional. Margaret had spent 15 years organizing books and helping children with homework, but 20 years of CIA training doesn't disappear just because you change careers. The confrontation was brief, quiet, and decisive. Margaret used techniques she had hoped never to need again, applied with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how much force was necessary and when to stop using it. By the time Chief Rodriguez arrived at the front entrance, the situation was already resolved. 3 unconscious foreign operatives were zip-tied with library materials, their weapons secured, and their communications equipment disabled. Margaret was sitting calmly at the reference desk, looking exactly like a librarian who had just finished processing returned books. "Miss Margaret?" Rodriguez called out as he entered the building. "We got a call about suspicious activity." "Oh, thank goodness you're here," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the rear of the building. "I found these 3 men trying to break into the library. I think they might be those researchers who have been asking strange questions around town." Rodriguez examined the scene with the careful attention of someone who had been a police officer long enough to recognize when situations didn't quite make sense. 3 professional-looking men, unconscious but not seriously injured, secured with materials that suggested considerable expertise in restraint techniques. A librarian who seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just overpowered multiple intruders. "Miss Margaret," he said slowly, "exactly how did you manage to subdue 3 men by yourself?" Margaret adjusted her glasses and smiled the same gentle smile she had worn for 15 years. "Oh, you know how it is, Chief. When you spend enough time organizing books, you learn how to handle situations efficiently. The official report described the incident as an attempted burglary thwarted by an alert librarian and swift police response. The 3 suspects were identified as foreign nationals with expired visas, likely involved in some form of industrial espionage or identity theft scheme. They were quietly deported after brief questioning that revealed nothing of intelligence value. The community of Millbrook celebrated Margaret as a local hero, praising her courage and quick thinking. The story of the brave librarian who fought off burglars became part of the town's folklore, repeated with growing embellishment at coffee shops and town meetings. Margaret accepted the praise graciously and returned to her normal routines as quickly as possible. She continued helping children with homework, recommending books to her patrons, and serving as the community's informal counselor and resource coordinator. But some things had changed. Tommy Patterson now spent more time at the library, not just as a student, but as someone who understood that Margaret might sometimes need an extra set of eyes watching the community. Sarah Mitchell made a point of checking in regularly, offering assistance with anything that might require special knowledge. Chief Rodriguez began consulting Margaret about unusual visitors or situations that didn't quite fit normal patterns. Margaret had revealed just enough of her capabilities to handle the crisis, but not so much that anyone felt compelled to ask uncomfortable questions about her background. The people of Millbrook knew that their librarian was more than she appeared to be, but they also understood that some stories are more important when they remain untold. David Kowalski called 3 weeks later, using the secure line that Margaret had hoped to never need again. "We've been analyzing the foreign operation," he said. "It looks like they were part of a larger network targeting former CIA operatives living under deep cover. Your exposure led us to identify and neutralize cells in 4 other cities." "I'm glad I could help," Margaret replied, "but I hope this is the end of it." "It should be. Your location is definitely blown, though. We can have extraction and relocation protocols ready within." "No," Margaret interrupted. "I'm staying." "Phoenix, that's not advisable. If they know who you are and where you are, then they also know that I'm not alone here. They know that this community will protect me the same way I've protected it. They know that any operation against me will have to go through all of them." David was quiet for a moment. "You're really going to spend the rest of your life as a small-town librarian?" Margaret looked out the library window at Main Street, where Tommy Patterson was walking home from school. Sarah Mitchell was picking up her daughter from daycare, and Chief Rodriguez was making his evening patrol rounds. All of them people who had become part of her life in ways that her CIA career had never allowed. "I spent 20 years keeping other people's secrets," she said. "Now I'm keeping my own and helping other people keep theirs. It's the best job I've ever had." 5 years later, Margaret Chen remains the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library. She has become an institution in the community, someone who connects people with information, resources, and each other. Her story of fighting off burglars has become local legend, but the real story of who she was and what she had done remains her secret. Tommy Patterson graduated from high school and went on to study criminal justice, inspired by his work helping Margaret with community safety projects. He returns to Millbrook during college breaks and always stops by the library to check if Margaret needs any assistance with special research projects. Sarah Mitchell became the hospital's emergency services coordinator, implementing security protocols and crisis response procedures that impressed state health department inspectors with their sophistication and effectiveness. She never asked Margaret where she had learned so much about personal security, and Margaret never volunteered the information. Chief Rodriguez retired 2 years later, but not before training his replacement to pay special attention to Margaret's observations about unusual visitors or suspicious activities. The Millbrook Police Department's clearance rate for unusual cases improved dramatically during Rodriguez's final years, though he could never quite explain why his instincts had become so much more reliable. Dr. Harper expanded the free clinic services to include counseling and support programs that seemed remarkably well designed for a small-town medical facility. She often consulted Margaret about community needs and resource allocation, relying on the librarian's seemingly intuitive understanding of what people needed before they knew they needed it. The library itself became the unofficial center of Millbrook's social support network, with Margaret serving as the invisible coordinator who connected people facing problems with people who could help solve them. Her techniques were so subtle that most people never realized they were being guided toward solutions. They simply found that the right resources appeared at exactly the right times. Margaret never used her CIA training operationally again, but she used the skills she had learned every single day. Reading people, understanding motivations, recognizing threats, and building networks of trust and mutual support. The same abilities that had made her effective as an intelligence operative made her invaluable as a community guardian. She had thought she was retiring from the business of protecting people. Instead, she had found a way to do it more completely and more personally than she ever had during her official career. Some victories are measured in territory captured or enemies defeated. Others are measured in lives protected and communities strengthened. Margaret's greatest success wasn't the foreign intelligence operation she had disrupted or the classified secrets she had kept safe. Her greatest success was creating a place where people felt secure enough to ask for help, intelligent enough to provide it, and connected enough to know that they weren't facing their problems alone. She had taken everything she had learned about human nature in the world's most dangerous places and used it to build something beautiful in one of the world's safest places. The people of Millbrook never learned that their librarian had once carried state secrets across hostile borders. They never discovered that the woman who helped them find books had once tracked foreign operatives through urban surveillance networks. They never realized that their quiet, cardigan-wearing community treasure had skills that most intelligence professionals only dreamed of possessing. But they did understand that Margaret Chen was someone special, someone who made their lives better in ways both obvious and mysterious. They knew that she could be trusted with their secrets, relied upon in crises, and counted on to know exactly what they needed, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. And that was exactly what Margaret had always wanted, to be someone who mattered, not because of what she had done in classified operations, but because of what she chose to do every day for people who would never know her real story. Have you ever met someone like Margaret Chen? Someone who seemed perfectly ordinary but possessed extraordinary wisdom? Someone who helped you in ways that went far beyond their official job description? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they guided, protected, or supported you. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Daily Soldier Stories. We're here to honor not just the warriors who fight in distant conflicts, but the guardians who build strength in our everyday communities. Because the most important intelligence operations are often the ones that help people understand they're not alone in facing life's challenges. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the most valuable secrets are the ones that remind us how much we matter to each other.